Everyone. Today is our final video lecture, and we're going to finish up talking about Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. We're going to look at chapter 7 and the conclusion, and then we're going to, either in this video or a separate video, have some concluding remarks about the entire semester. Try and tie it all up in something like a bow. But so for now, let's finish with Fanon. In these final chapters, chapter 7 and chapter 8, we get some conclusion to the meditations that preceded. We remember in particular chapters 4 and 5, where Fanon is sort of cycling through the various forms of racism that he encounters and his responses to it. Right? What he's searching for is some sort of way of expressing himself, right? Expressing, I hesitate to say the word identity, but to, express himself as himself. One of the main themes of chapter 5 in particular, and the whole book, right, which gets to the title of the book, right, Black Skin, White Masks. One of the main struggles is the difficulty of expressing a self for Fanon that isn't filtered through white ideology, white ideas, white history, white values. So that, right, this idea of the white mask is the way that every expression of the identity, experience, values of the subaltern, right, the colonized, the oppressed, the alienated. Any attempt on the part of the alienated to express themselves gets taken up by the powers that be, the establishment, by the colonizer, by white culture, European culture, and right, expressed in those terms, right? So the experience of the colonized gets taken up by the colonizer and articulated through the language and values of the colonizer, so that every attempt by the colonized to express themselves as themselves gets covered over with this mask, right? Gets masked by the colonizer power. I think this is really the key idea. I mean, there are a lot of key ideas, but in terms of thinking about how this relates to other things that we've read, in particular Foucault, I think that this idea is important, right? That power, and above all, oppressive power, reproduces itself and maintains itself by maintaining an ideology that any attacks against that power will be neutralized through that reigning ideology. So, for example, I think the example in chapter 5, where Fanon is talking about Sartre, is uh, a good illustration of this. The Fanon is asking Sartre, right, what he makes of sort of Black liberation movement and the movement for decolonization in general. And what Fanon is looking for is some sort of affirmation of mm, the irreducibility of the Black Power movement, of Black liberation movement. And by irreducible, what Fanon means, what I mean, is that the assertion of Black power, of Black values, of the other, cannot be reduced to being the same as white culture, European culture. That European culture shouldn't be able to incorporate any sort of system of values or experience into its own framework. Right? That the framework of European ideology is sort of sinister in its very ability to incorporate any other ideology or set of ideas or values, right? So when Fanon is asking Sartre about the affirmation of Black identity that would be irreducible to European identity, and Sartre says, well, the Black liberation movement is a reaction to colonization, and therefore the expression of identity that comes from the Black liberation movement is ultimately reducible to a movement of history that is essentialized and understood as European and through a European framework. Right, to say, yes, all of this, the Black liberation movement, the decolonization of Africa, the West Indies, South America, all of that is good, right? We affirm that, but it is reducible to a larger history in which Europe is the central subject and agent. So to find what Fanon is looking for is some respite from this totalizing European worldview, right, where everything can be reduced to European philosophy. Everything can be incorporated into European values and political systems. How do we escape that? How does the colonized escape the fate of merely being incorporated and assimilated into the culture of the colonizer? And this is, in addition to continuing to be a critical question in thinking about race relations and, more generally, social justice, is also interesting in relation to Foucault and Freud and the other sort of analyses of social power that we've looked at, right? Because what Fanon is, in some sense, expressing is the real misery that can be caused by systems of social power. Um, where, for example, we could say that the ideological assumption that, for example, Martinican culture is uh, historically deficient in comparison to European culture. Like, that is an ideological assumption. It is a stereotype. It is more than a stereotype. Um, a kind of cultural um, well, I don't know how to put it better, I suppose, than it's a function of ideology. And what that means is that the idea of European superiority, however that's expressed, uh, is an idea that is useful to the reproduction of a particular power dynamic, and particular political organization, political structure. Uh, that idea, right, of white superiority uh, justifies a system in which, right, the Black population is systematically exploited, uh, enslaved, and otherwise abused. And so that idea is part of the violence. Uh, and what's really difficult about ideology, right, and fighting those kinds of ideas that are ingrained at a cultural level, at a long-standing cultural level, and also then at the level of political expediency, organization, political goals, is that any attempt to break that ideology, the ideology of white supremacy, of white superiority, uh, is in danger of being appropriated by the same white culture. Right? And so, I'm using this word appropriation. This is not one of the words that Fanon uses, but it's definitely connected. Right? If you think of, rap, for example, as an expression of an experience and a personhood that sets itself in opposition to the establishment, political establishment, sets itself in opposition to right, white culture, the culture of the colonizer. Rap music is a powerful sort of statement of independence from white culture, from white values, and in that statement of independence, also then carves out a space to assert an identity that is going to be in competition or in opposition to the establishment, status quo, the reigning ideology. So rap music has this powerful potential. But then what happens? Right? That same reigning ideology, same culture of, European white values, the culture of white superiority against which rap music is sort of explicitly formulated. That established culture figures out how to incorporate and appropriate rap music for its own uses, right? So that soon, you see rap music being used in commercials to sell cars or, um, you know, whatever, insurance. And you see uh, rappers become, embraced by mainstream culture. Uh, and on the one hand, you could say there's to some extent the lessons of uh, the lessons of rap, of hip hop, um, have reached mainstream culture and made their impact. And to some extent, I'm sure you can find instances of that. Um, but the other thing to say would be that by incorporating, right, rap music, what happens is that the real political and psychological power of it is neutralized. Right? It is no longer oppositional, but has been recruited into the ranks of the establishment. Um, that it has been appropriated as a tool for, again, reproducing the same establishment power. Um, this is very complicated stuff, but I mean, I think that is roughly what Fanon is explaining, right? The way that every expression of the identity, the selfhood of the colonized uh, is immediately covered over and masked, right? A white mask is put on it so that it can become acceptable to the culture of the colonizer, the culture of the established power. So, how do you fight against this power of appropriation? How do you establish independence from this system that is constantly trying to take that independence, right? Trying to appropriate uh, whatever the terms or the content of that independence is. I mean, this is certainly connected, and Fanon is as a Marxist, aware of this, right? This is certainly connected to the problem of capitalism also, right? Um, how can you fight against capitalism except through capitalist means? Um, how do you find uh, any moment of respite from this system which has as its goal the totalization of all being? So, one of the main issues here with appropriation, with the erasure of the true independence or uniqueness, irreducibility of non European cultures and experiences, is uh, the idea of recognition. What happens when, for example, rap music is uh, sort of the power of rap music, let's say, is reduced to nothing more than its commercial appeal, right? Its marketability. Whenever that sort of that enclave where power in opposition to the establishment can grow, whenever that enclave becomes commercialized, whenever its value turns into market value, then that power has been neutralized. Because then the success of that power has to follow the same logic as everything else in society, which is the logic of the market. And the logic of the market is the logic of, again, ultimately the colonizer, those who from the beginning have benefited from the terms of free trade, the terms of global capitalism, the terms of capitalism in general. What happens there, right, when political value is reduced to market value, is a failure of recognition, right? We could say that one doesn't see the other as asserting an identity that is oppositional, independent, genuine, but rather as an opportunity for me to make money. It doesn't recognize the other as other. It reduces the assertion of identity by the other to a value proposition for me. Now, this idea of recognition is key to what Fanon thinks is the only sort of road out of racism and racial exploitation. Recognition means recognizing that the other person cannot be reduced to you yourself. Now, just in general, I mentioned in an earlier video, in the first video on Fanon, this concept of the other as other, right? The other as irreducible to myself. To recognize the other person as being truly different from yourself and allowing the other person to be different, right, is to recognize the other as other. And, I think it's maybe easiest to think about this in terms of in friendship or relationships, romantic relationships, where there comes a point where you recognize that the other person has different values than you. There are certain things that perhaps you just disagree about. And maybe those other values the other person has annoy you. You wish that they would, you know, make the bed in the morning, or something trivial, something silly. Um, and at some point, you realize, right, they just don't care about that. They're just not going to do that. Um, and you realize, right, that's all right. Right? Uh, what I like about this person is not that we have all the same values. I don't like this person because they are identical to me. I like them because they're different. And I have to recognize that there are going to be differences that I like and differences that I don't like. And in that moment, right, of allowing the other person to, have their values, to not try to change the other person to fit your values, that is recognition. Um, so that is sort of the key idea, right, to not demand that all people accept the same set of values, to recognize that different people will have different values. And at a higher level, then, right, this is a question of intercultural relation also, right, to recognize and allow other cultures, other peoples to be different. And this is not to say, this is explicitly not to say that, um, there are certain inherent values that come with white skin or black skin, right? No, absolutely not. Right? Fanon explicitly rejects that. There are no black values. There are no white values. All values are either culturally and ideologically imposed, or are freely determined by an individual. So it's not that there is a sort of fact of values, right? That these people have these values and these other people have these other values, and we just have to recognize the different values. It is instead, I think, the recognition that history establishes positions for different peoples and different groups of people, and that one's position with respect to other peoples and groups is going to impact your values and your behavior, your way of life, your view of the world. And that just as it is an act of violence to refuse to allow the other to be other, it is also violence to denigrate or write off, dismiss a set of cultural values that are different from your own. So this idea of recognition, what is being recognized? Recognized means to have someone recognize you as yourself, as independent, as an independent power in yourself, not as a means to someone else's ends, not as an object. We mentioned in discussion of chapter 5, right, the fact of blackness. We went into the discussion about objectification. And that's a question for your final papers also. So objectification is the opposite of recognition. To fail to recognize the other person as an other person is to objectify them. I don't see you as another person communicating with me. I see you as XYZ stereotype, right? As an image, as that racial epidermal schema that he mentions in chapter 5. Right? So that objectification is a failure of recognition, failure to recognize the true humanity of a person. So recognition and objectification are opposite terms. Now, this whole framework of recognition that Fanon is using in chapter 7 is a continuation of an idea presented by Hegel, and in part B of chapter 7, the Negro and Hegel, Fanon is making this explicit. And Hegel's theory of recognition, which Fanon explains at some length, is outlined in a chapter of Hegel's called the master-slave dialectic, or rather called lordship and bondage, but often referred to as the master-slave dialectic. And in this, Hegel explains the way there is a dialectical relationship between people, right? People that need to be recognized by others in order to recognize themselves. That I am unable to validate myself unless what I am is recognized by an other. Now, in lordship and bondage, what happens is that this dialectic in which two people are seeking recognition from each other is, in this dialectic, there is a moment of conflict necessarily. That every interpersonal relationship begins with a kind of competition for recognition. And in this process, right, power moves back and forth between the two self-consciousnesses, as Hegel says, the two people that are struggling for recognition. So that in my desire to be recognized, I am tempted to turn the other person into, as Hegel says, a bondsman, into a slave, someone that exists for my own sake. You exist in order to recognize me. You will recognize me as X, Y, and Z. That's a relationship of master to bondsman. Your existence is derived from my existence. The value of your existence is derived from the value of my existence. You exist to recognize me and to validate me as what I think I am, subordinate to me. But, Hegel says, however this first stage happens, however it is that one of the people gains the upper hand, gains power in the relationship, such that when we go in, two of us each looking for recognition, one of them comes out being recognized. Right? Someone has to be recognized first. And in that moment, right, there is a power imbalance. However, the next stage of development here is that the bondsman, the person who's been subordinated, understands that the master, the Lord, person in power, only has power because, in the first place, they were granted that recognition, and that without the bondsman, without the slave, the master, the Lord, is not what he is. That, in fact, the power of the master comes from being recognized as such by the slave. And so the slave can take away the power of the master by withdrawing that recognition. Then the roles are reversed. The bondsman realizes that, in fact, he has the power, that the master's power is dependent on him. And in fact, the master as master is subordinate to the bondsman, because without bondsman, he couldn't be master. So this transfer of power to the bondsman in Hegel's analysis leads to, ultimately, the cancellation of the whole power dynamic of master and bondsman. Because in that moment where the bondsman recognizes that, in fact, he has the power to either make or unmake the master, in that moment, what happens is not the reversal of master-slave relationship, such that the former bondsman becomes the master, the former master becomes the new bondsman. But instead, in recognizing the bondsman actually has power, we don't get this reversal, but we instead get a evening out, a synthesis of the two. So that the next stage is the realization that each must recognize the other as independent individuals, recognize that neither is subordinate or derived from the other. And there is the opportunity for equality. You have to go through, Hegel thinks, this struggle for power, struggle for recognition, in order to get to that moment of equality. So on 216, the Negro and Hegel, Fanon writes, man is human only to the extent to which he tries to impose his existence on another man in order to be recognized by him. So I am only human to the extent that that humanity is recognized by someone else, to the extent that I can get someone else to recognize my humanity. He goes on, as long as he has not been effectively recognized by the other, that other will remain the theme of his actions. I need recognition from the other. Again, right, that makes me think of those, the Million Men March and the I am a man signs, right? That is the attempt to impose one's humanity on the other that refuses to recognize you. I demand to be recognized as a man, as a human. It is on that other being, on recognition by that other being, that his own human worth and reality depend. Uh, and then a little below on 217, there is not an open conflict between white and black. One day, the white master, without conflict, recognized the Negro slave. Uh, right. So I think what he means here is, um, in order for there to be enslavement, there already has to be recognition. Right? The conflict, the violence of enslavement is this further demand, a demand to be solely recognized. The former slave wants to make himself recognized. Right? That is to say, to get, right, kind of conscious definitional recognition. Now, here I think is Fanon's. Well, let's read. At the foundation of Hegelian dialectic, there is an absolute reciprocity which must be emphasized. It is in the degree to which I go beyond my own immediate being that I apprehend the existence of the other as a natural and more than natural reality. Okay, so like for Hegel, this mutual recognition requires reciprocity, the foundation of the Hegelian dialectic. There's an absolute reciprocity. Bondsman and Lord make one another what they are. The bondsman is not bondsman without the Lord, and the Lord is not Lord without the bondsman. They need each other. And it's only when they recognize that mutual need that they're able to break that cycle. If I close the circuit, if I prevent the accomplishment of movement in two directions, I keep the other within myself. Ultimately, I deprive him even of this being for itself. So, what is happening? Right? The reason why one refuses, the reason why there is a refusal to recognize the independence, irreducibility of the colonized, is because to do so would be to jeopardize the power of the colonizer. Right? If I refuse that reciprocity, if I refuse to recognize the other person, then I can maintain power over them. So the refusal of recognition is a power move, an attempt to keep the other within oneself, right? To keep the other subordinated to oneself. And ultimately, I deprive him even of this being for itself. Right? I deprive them thereby of their ability to be for themselves rather than be for another, for the Lord. He goes on, I think here's the most important passage. The only means of breaking this vicious circle that throws me back on myself is to restore to the other, through mediation and recognition, this human reality, which is different from natural reality. The other has to perform the same operation. So, to break this vicious cycle of colonizer and colonized, this power dynamic that is destructive to both, but ruinous for the colonized, what is needed is to restore to the other his human reality, to make the other person human, to humanize everyone equally. Now, this is the ultimate problem. How can one force someone to recognize their humanity? How can I force someone to recognize my humanity? And in this, Fanon is going to agree with Hegel. This demands some moment of conflict, some moment of confrontation. So he says on 218, human reality in itself, for itself, can be achieved only through conflict and through the risk that conflict implies. So one can only demonstrate one's humanity through conflict. And Fanon will say this really explicitly elsewhere in, for example, a book I've mentioned before, The Wretched of the Earth, where he'll say, some amount of violent conflict is inevitable and not entirely bad, precisely because it is only in this conflict that one can truly recognize the other as human, right? I think we can think also of, the protests that are, the Black Lives Matter protests of this summer that have been going on for the last, almost decade now. Well, no, not quite decade, but 7 years. What are those protests and demonstrations about? Not so differently from the Million Man March. It's about demanding recognition, right? To demand that the image, that I think that there is a sort of view in a lot of white America where these, racial stereotypes are very prominent that, that does objectify African Americans in general. Not perhaps in the way those stereotypes worked in the 1950s, but through that indifference that Fanon mentioned also, right? Where one doesn't really think about the conditions of life, the experience of the subaltern class of African Americans, of any minority or oppressed group. One, in that sort of indifferent, thoughtless, and ideologically justified way, one thinks this is how it is. This is how it's supposed to be, right? And in hearing about the police brutality against Black men, or hearing about the disparities between healthcare for the Black population and white population, one objectifies by saying something along the lines of like, well, quote unquote, they're used to it, or that's the way life is, right? That's natural. All of those are forms of objectification, right? And I think that's important, right? That Fanon keeps stressing this point, right? What needs to be recognized is human reality, which is different from natural reality. And so to say, go out and demonstrate, to protest, to impose one's humanity, is to say, just because this is the way things are doesn't mean this is the way things should be. Uh, it doesn't, you know, um, I think what's in essence what I'm trying to get at here is uh, this racist idea that essentially, right? It is uh, that the former colonized, former slaves uh, don't have a right to demand things, right? And that refusal of the right to demand things is a refusal to recognize the humanity of the people making those demands. Humans get to demand things. Humans uh, get to demand that things be different. Right? Humans are right oriented toward their future. Uh, they get to make judgments about how they want that future to look, and to dismiss demands about one's future, right? To not hear those is to say you are, in essence, an animal uh, who will deal with the future when it comes. Right? You don't have that human capacity to shape the future. Uh, So conflict is necessary. Conflict is the way that one demonstrates that one does shape one's own future, uh, to show that one's demands are as valid and real and powerful as anyone else's demands. Uh, and so this is, another issue Fanon has with the way that decolonization happens. Um, and I think, yeah, where right the danger that Fanon sees decolonization is that liberation was often given by the colonizer rather than won through war by the colonized. And the danger in that is that by generously giving the colonized freedom, the colonizer avoids a conflict that would force them to genuinely recognize the humanity of the colonized. And by making this concession of relinquishing political control directly over the colonized country, by making that concession, the colonizer is in fact better able to continue to fail to truly recognize the colonized. So, uh, he said on 221, right? But the Negro knows nothing of the cost of freedom, for he has not fought for it. From time to time, he has fought for liberty and justice, but these were always white liberty and white justice, that is, values secreted by his masters. So, what does Fanon mean here, right? What should the colonized fight for? Should fight for independence, ontological independence, right? To reuse that phrase from earlier, right? Ontological resistance. To fight for true, irreducible independence from European culture, European values. Now, I don't know. I think I'm not sure we need to decide whether or not Fanon is right about this. I think it's an interesting observation, comment. Conflict is necessary, and wherever conflict is avoided by the colonizer, it is in an attempt, in fact, to maintain the power dynamic in which they are the Lord, right, the master. So, in thinking about how we grant humanity, how we think about humanity, I think the conclusion for now, for Fanon, would be humanity is won through a conflict with those forces that would make you subordinate, that would objectify you, and that humanity lies not in, being acknowledged to fit into some universal definition of being human, but that humanity consists in one's assertion of oneself as equally justified to anyone else. So that does it for chapter 7. I want to make just a few comments about the conclusion, also where he continues these themes. One of the main themes of this book has been history and abuses of history. To what extent are we tied to our history? And a lot of the anxiety that Fanon expresses has to do with his relation to history, right? The way the history of the West Indies, the history of Africa is portrayed in Western academia, Western media, and the sort of historical ideas on which racism is founded, right? All this anxiety about representing Black history, Black values, Black culture, right? Culture that would be derived from history, and then also contending with the history of Europe and the history of European values. In conclusion, we get a very different set and a real break from this historical consciousness. So on page 226, he writes, the problem considered here is one of time. Those Negroes and white men will be disalienated who refuse to let themselves be sealed away in the materialized tower of the past. For many other Negroes in other ways, disalienation will come into being through their refusal to accept the present as definitive. Right? So to refuse to live in the past, we will be disalienated when we refuse to be sealed in the tower of the past. And right, disalienated when we refuse to accept the present as definitive. The past doesn't determine the present, and the present doesn't determine the future. I am now in the present, free to be what I want to be. And as such, right, I don't have to be what the past has determined me to be. And I can be in the future something totally different than I have been in the past, or than my past would lead one to think I would be. So he goes on, in no way should I derive my basic purpose from the past of the peoples of color. In no way should I dedicate myself to the revival of an unjustly unrecognized Negro civilization. I will not make myself the man of any past. I do not want to exalt the past at the expense of my present and my future. So we get caught up in analyzing the past and in worrying about what the past forebodes for our future. Fanon is saying, right, we need to escape the past. We precisely need to forget the historical determinations and think about what we can achieve in the future. So on page 227, he goes on, right? So having said this, I don't need to feel beholden to any historical culture. I don't need to feel, that I have some duty to speak for my history, my ancestors, etc. Right? We remember in chapter 5 that moment also where Fanon is having this anxiety about feeling like a representative for all of Black culture and Black history. And his argument now is, right, why should I feel beholden to that? And I think this is the existentialist in Fanon coming out pretty clearly here, right? We know that Fanon and Sartre had a close relationship, and Fanon is very much connected not just to sort of Marxist, post-colonialist thinkers, but also to existentialism. And here we certainly see that existentialist idea of freedom, right? I am a surging power that can be whatever he chooses to be. We see that idea coming out here. Right? I don't need to be beholden to my past. On 227, he writes, my Black skin is not the wrapping of specific values. Right? I don't need to accept the values that I'm told are appropriate for my skin color based on some fallacious idea of history. He goes on, interestingly, right? It is a long time since the starry sky that took away Kant's breath, the last of its secrets to us, and the moral law is not certain of itself. Right? So, with this reference to Kant, who we haven't looked at this semester, what he is challenging there is the idea explicitly that there is a universal ethics or a absolute and objective right way to be a person or a society. So he continues with this, right? Have I no other purpose on earth then but to avenge the Negro of the 17th century? Right? Do I really have to organize my life around injustices that took place 300 years ago? And we've come through this whole book. We see the extent to which the injustices of 300 years ago and the way that indeed, right, our world today is colored by and informed by the colonial era, by slavery, by all these injustices of the 17th and 18th century. But Fanon is saying, even despite all of that, right, just because the past has completely shaped our world, right, doesn't mean that in this present moment we can't change the world, that we can't direct ourselves to a different future. And then he goes on, right? I think he's getting to, again, these sort of existentialist ideas about what it means to be a person. Because I, as a man of color, do not have the right to seek ways of stamping down the pride of my former master. I, as a man of color, do not have the right to hope that in the white man there will be a crystallization of guilt toward the past of my race. I have neither the right nor the duty to claim reparation for the domestication of my ancestors. There is no Negro mission. There is no white burden. I find myself suddenly in a world in which things do evil, and a world in which I am summoned into battle, a world in which it is always a question of annihilation or triumph. I find myself, I, a man, in a world where words wrap themselves in silence, in a world where the other endlessly hardens himself. No, I do not have the right to go and cry out my hatred at the white man. I do not have the duty to murmur my gratitude to the white man. My life is caught in the lasso of existence. My freedom turns me back on myself. No, I do not have the right to be a Negro. I do not have the duty to be this or that. If the white man challenges my humanity, I will impose my whole weight as a man on his life. I will impose my whole weight as a man on his life and show him that I am not that show-good eaten that he persists in imagining. I find myself suddenly in the world and I recognize that I have one right alone, that of demanding human behavior from the other. One duty alone, that of not renouncing my freedom through my choices. So there are no historically determined duties. History does not demand anything from us. History does not require anything from us. Right? The only duty that I have is to not renounce my freedom. The only right that I have is to demand human behavior. Right? So, in the end, what we need is recognition. And that recognition consists in the responsibility to be a human, that is to say, to act freely, right? To not renounce one's freedom. And one demand, right? The demand that everyone behave humanly. Right? So to be a human and to demand that others be human. Right? This is sort of baseline. So again, on page 231, I think this is the fullest expression of this. Right? Forget all that history. Forget how I am in relation to X, Y, and Z group. Forget the way the relationship between colonizer and colonized has distorted psychology and created alienation. All of that is part of the structure of the past. And our way forward through recognition demands not reliance on past values, past ideas, or even analysis of the past. What is required to move forward with this recognition is a recognition of myself as uh, as the foundation of value. Um, I, in an existentialist kind of way, moving forward, will decide for myself what is valuable, what should be done, what my duties and responsibilities are. I won't be told who I am or what I have to do or how I should be by history or culture or philosophy or anything. And on 231, he says, the body of history does not determine a single one of my actions. I am my own foundation. And it is by going beyond the historical instrumental hypotheses that I will initiate the cycle of my freedom. So this right idea of being one's own foundation uh, is key to being recognized, to recognizing others, to transcending stereotypes, and above all, to transcending history. If we're ever going to escape history and the determinations of history, uh, what is required is to think of ourselves as our own foundations. We begin entirely anew in each moment. And in each moment, what arises anew is our being, a being which has the possibility of changing the course of history, of introducing something entirely new. Uh, and that is the freedom of humanity. And that freedom is the only possibility of escaping the cycle of exploitation and injustices that was set in motion in that 17th century of colonization uh, and enslavement. So, to conclude, 232, page 232, Fanon writes, "Was my freedom not given to me then, in order to the was my freedom not given to me then, in order to build the world of the you?" And this is an interesting idea, right? I think this idea of building the world of the you is in opposition to building the world of the I. The colonial world is the world of the I, where everything revolves around the interests of the colonizer, the interests of the master. Everything is reduced to the master. Everything is subordinate to the master. Uh, in order to break that, uh, what we need is a world in which others uh, are affected by others, where people uh, find themselves, find their own freedom through the freedom of others. To base my I in a you, rather than to reduce you to a function of I, of me. At the conclusion of this study, I want the world to recognize with me the open door of every consciousness. My final prayer, oh my body, make of me always a man who questions. So the end, right, this freedom is achieved through questioning, through allowing oneself to recognize others, allowing others to influence and change us, um, that is freedom. That's what it means to be human outside of a master slave dialectic. Um, all right, that'll do it for today. I'm going to get another video off to you sort of with some concluding thoughts about the semester as a whole. But that should do it for today.